guys, here's chapter 8, key issue 4. This is your last video for the semester. Woo woo! So yeah, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to launch into really quick is the Cold War. So, I think I may have talked about this a little bit in a previous class, but basically the Cold War happens right after World War II. So World War II ends, and the great powers of the world, like Great Britain and France and Germany, were no longer great powers because they were so damaged by the war. So, two new superpowers emerge, and that is the United States and the Soviet Union. And the competition is to see which country is going to be the strongest. Now, the U.S. is obviously going to be capitalist and democratic, whereas the Soviet Union is going to be communist and under pretty much autocratic, governments, okay? And that's important because between 1944 and 1990, each was trying to either have democracy prevail or communism prevail, okay? So the U.S. wanted to help nations become democracies, and the Soviet Union wanted nations to fall to communism, okay? So, the thing about the Cold War is it isn't actually a war in the traditional sense. Nobody fights between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It's a war largely based on brinkmanship, meaning one side threatening the other. The nuclear arms race, who can get the most nuclear weapons. The space race is a part of it, who can get space exploration first. And another way that it is fought is two rival alliances. So this is when we get the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and the Warsaw Pact, okay? So these are two military alliances. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is all the democratic nations. So Great Britain, obviously, France, those other democratic powers in Europe were aligned with the U.S., whereas the Warsaw Pact was pretty much the Soviet Union and lots of countries in Eastern Europe, because most of those countries in Eastern Europe at this time are technically part of the Soviet Union, okay? So, again, no fighting ever happens, but what we get out of the Cold War is a lot of political conflict, right? Because we have two countries vying for power, and out of it we get these two rival alliances. It's important to know, like, whose is whose, right? So the U.S. is NATO, the Warsaw Pact is the Soviet Union. And luckily, neither one of them ever gets used. But the way it works is if a country, let's say the Soviet Union, threatens the U.S. can count on all other NATO nations to come together and help them out. And same as for the Soviet Union. If something were to happen to one of the Warsaw Pact nations, or like the Soviet Union, then all those other countries would help bail out the Soviet Union, okay? All right, so again, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, these are all created by communism and democracy in this battle between these two countries, but there's no battle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So it's a Cold War. It's called cold because there isn't like literal fighting. Luckily, it never gets there. Okay, and then after the Cold War, so as I mentioned earlier, this is Eastern Europe, okay? And at one time, at the height of the Soviet Union's power, all of this orangey red color was part of the Soviet Union. So this is Russia, okay? And then all of these countries were under the control of Lenin and then later on Stalin, okay? It also shows you that these are all Warsaw Pact states, and the blue are all NATO states, okay? And then, of course, the U.S., which is over here. Not in this map, is also part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So what happens after the Cold War, part of the reason it ends in the 90s is because the Soviet Union falls apart. They go broke, and in a lot of these other smaller states, like Poland, like Czechoslovakia, they have their own revolutions and get their independence. So what happens is that process of devolution again. So whereas before they were all under the government of the Soviet Union, they break away and become their own autonomous states. Okay, autonomous meaning they have their own governmental power. And this happens again in Yugoslavia. They weren't considered part of the Warsaw Pact or part of the Soviet Union, but they were communist. And then at the end of the Cold War, that also happens. Yugoslavia breaks up into smaller countries like Serbia, Croatia, a lot of those Balkan states. Okie dokie. So, what we are talking about when we talk about the Warsaw Pact and NATO is a collection of supranations or supranational organizations, okay? So, this is another type of nation that you need to know, besides a nation state and just a nation in general. A supranation is also one you need to know. So, here's some examples. One is the European Union. A lot of these are created after World War II for a reason, right? We wanted to avoid another World War III or something like that. The European Union is created to help heal post-World War II division in Europe. So the way the European Union works is basically all countries rely on one another economically. So we're going to look into this more a little bit later because our discussion is actually on the European Union this round. But basically, the idea is if France and Britain have a strong economic bind, they're not going to go to war with one another because that would be bad for the country financially. So we'll talk about who's involved in the European Union, and actually there's lots of countries trying to leave the European Union now, so we'll talk about that later. But basically, a supranational organization is a bunch of different states in cooperation together, okay? ComCon is another example. It's a Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. And this is basically the communist version of the European Union. So same idea, all states rely on each other economically, which would in turn hopefully prevent war, and it's actually kind of worked. But this is the Soviet Union's kind of answer to the European Union. And then the United Nations, which we've talked about quite a few times, is also an example of a supranational organization because you have lots of member states, currently 193, and they all work together for a common cause, okay? So those are all examples of supranational organizations. The Warsaw Pact and NATO are also examples of supranational organizations, okay? I would definitely know the definition and know examples of supranations, okay? Alrighty. We talked about this a little bit because you guys read an article on terrorism, and we talked about how important it is to have a defined understanding of it because it's a term that gets used inappropriately in a lot of situations. So terrorism is the use of violence and intimidation in pursuit of political goals like spreading fear or spreading publicity. So there's a goal in mind, okay? Like we think about mass shootings as being these terrible things, but they're not terrorism necessarily. It depends on what the motive of the shooter was, okay? There has to be a motive, and it has to be a political motive. It's different than an act of war. It's different than assassinations. Acts of terror are aimed at ordinary people and do not focus on people of power, okay? So they target civilians, whereas in an act of war, you're typically targeting the soldiers or the military of that other nation, right? Okay. All right, so this is kind of going back to the devolution of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union after the Cold War ends. Sorry, but there's lots of reasons why states fail. Okay, so we call states fail when that central governing authority breaks down, and sometimes they break into different autonomous regions. Or we can also call a state a failed state if there is a lack of control of the government. Like if there's anarchy in that state, we would consider that a failed state because the state really is the governing body. So it doesn't have one of those, it's not really a state. Okay, so there's lots of reasons why this can happen. One is physical geography. Think of the way that different states are shaped, right? So we talked about how compact states are the ideal, but there's also different like pro-rupted states where it can be really difficult to have a unified government or a unified economy. So sometimes, like in a pro-rupted state, let's say that little offshoot, that little ear might break off and be its own state rather than be part of the larger state. Okay. Ethnic separatism, this is what happened during the breakup of Yugoslavia in the Cold War. So let me go back to that. Okay, so here's Yugoslavia, and your Chapter 7, Key Issue 2, I believe, talked about why nation states are so difficult to create, and a lot of times it's because there's just so much ethnic diversity. That was the problem in Yugoslavia. So in Yugoslavia, there were Croats, and they were Slovaks, and people spoke different languages, and it made it really, really difficult for all of those people to coexist. So when Yugoslavia broke up into smaller states, and remind me in class, and I can show you a map of this. I should have put a map of modern day Europe on here. But so they broke up into different states. So that would be devolution, but also the reason for that devolution was because of ethnic separatism. Okay? Terrorism is another reason states fail. Oftentimes, organizations like the Taliban or Al-Qaeda will push out existing governments. I would say ISIS does the same thing. So sometimes they literally can take over a state's government, or they can make it so difficult for that government to operate that there really is no power. Economic and social problems, things like civil war. Syria, I would call a failed state at this moment because they are in civil war. I would call the U.S. even a failed state momentarily during the Civil War. A breakup into two states, but since we were supposed to be a United States, I guess we would call it a failed state. And then I've talked about this before, irredentism, restoration of a nation based on cultural attributes. So an example would be Nazi Germany. So Germany we would consider a failed state during World War II because the Nazis said that only certain people, even living in these borders, are German, right? They had an ideal German race, and so they kind of separated from the rest of Germany, if that makes sense. The Islamic State as well would be an example of this. And remember, oh, never mind. I got sidetracked. The Islamic State is what ISIS is trying to create. Okay, so if you think about the Nation of Islam, they are basically trying to create a unified Islam with like the strictest laws and traditions of the faith. Okay, so there's lots of different variations of Islam, just like Christianity, and there are definitely more radical branches of Islam, and those would be the ones where we would find sympathy for ISIS and things like that. Okay? All right. So one more thing I want to add here is that devolution is increasing with technology. So technology has led to many more centrifugal forces. Ooh, I need to go over centrifugal versus centripetal. I'm going to do that in class. Okay. Has led to more centrifugal forces, led to more religious and cultural identities, and because there's this increased expression in identities, that leads to more fragmentation. Okay? So, the biggest phenomenon we've kind of witnessed with Twitter and Facebook is a lot of countries in the Middle East have now decided, I don't like living under this dictator anymore, and we want to be a democracy. So that's what's happening in Syria. That is what has happened in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya. And a lot of that happened because people were spreading their messages on Twitter and Facebook. So more technology has led to more devolution, and I would look at the Arab Spring kind of as an example. And then this also means that that need for supranations has also increased. So even though there's countries thinking about leaving the United Nations or the European Union, there's been a lot of emphasis on staying put just because devolution is now higher because of technology. Okay, so I'm going to go over centrifugal versus centripetal forces, but I think they're pretty straightforward. But I'll go over that in class, and remind me to show you a map of modern day Europe so I can show you what Yugoslavia used to be. Okay? All right. So there you go. You made it through a whole semester of me talking at you. Good for you. I will see you in class, and there might be a pop quiz.